Securities offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through CWM, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Carson Partners, a division of CWM, LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. This is The Way to Wealth, with host Scott Ford, a jiu-jitsu fighting, woodworking, beekeeping entrepreneur who is also the managing director, partner, and wealth advisor of Carson Wealth. Financial freedom is the goal, and clarity and simplicity is how we'll get there. Let's get to it. This is Way to Wealth.
Hello, and welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple, allowing you to focus on living life and doing that now, not 30 years from today. Very excited to have our special guest on today's podcast, Mr. David Walker. And so before giving just a little bit of the backstory, I'd just like to say hello, David. Thank you for joining the Way to Wealth podcast and audience.
Good to be with you, Scott.
Yeah, look forward to our conversation. We had a little preamble here before we kicked off, but just so the audience knows, David is the former U.S. Comptroller General, so certainly non-practicing CPA, former professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. And yeah, he has a lot of work out there. So we could probably do half a day, but we don't have that time allotted. So I'm excited. He's got a lot to share, a unique perspective. And I think it'll be really meaningful what we're going to be able to jump into here today. So again, thanks for joining, David. So, you have multiple books out there that I've read. The most recent one that I'm not the whole way through, but I've dug into, and I have some intriguing things I want to ask you about, but America in 2040. Let's just start there, if it's okay. What's the premise of the book, and what are you up to that you're either concerned about or excited about that you would want to share with the audience?
Well, first, the full title of the book is America in 2040, Still a Superpower, a Pathway to Success. And, I'm a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. My wife is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. We've had family in this country back to the 1600s. And we love this country, and we're very concerned about where it is and about where it's headed. And the premise of the book is, what does it take to be a modern day superpower? And basically what I articulate is it takes a country that has global economic, diplomatic, military power, and cultural influence. And today, the United States meets that definition. Russia does not. I would argue that China does. But the real question is, where are we headed? And will we remain a superpower based upon where we're headed? The key to becoming a superpower and staying a superpower is economics. Economic power means that you have diplomatic influence, gives you the ability to have a strong military capability, and causes others to be able to want to emulate you because of those reasons from a cultural standpoint. But if you can't put your finances in order, and we clearly don't have our finances in order, with escalating debt as a percentage of the economy, with escalating interest as a percentage of the budget. If you can't put your finances in order, you're not going to stay strong economically, and everything else will end up suffering. So what I do is I talk about what things could look like in 2040 if we don't change course. I also learn the lessons from COVID-19, lessons from history, past superpowers, most of which are no longer with us, and why they're no longer with us. And then what are some of the challenges that we faced, and what's the best way to address them? So bottom line, wake up call to action, way forward to make sure that the answer to the question can be yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that about your work in the book. You do call out challenges / problems, and you do also share solutions from your perspective, which I think that's not everyone does that, but it's like, if we're going to call something out, let's come up with a way forward. So I appreciate that. I'm going to go back a bit, because one of the things that stuck out early on for me in your book is at the beginning, you talk about the Constitution and where it came from and things that were left out. Well, my vision, what I'm up to. So this is the Way to Wealth podcast, and it's really a part of four things that I call the infinite entrepreneur. So for me, just always been an entrepreneur. It's been in my DNA. I somehow was born in there from my dad, I think, but I've not been able to shake it, and I don't want to shake it. So for me, that's my driver. It always has been. And so there's four things. To me, it starts with what we have as a business called Legato Family. And Legato Family is, how do you create a enduring family? Because at the end of the day, yes, we need finances as a country, and yes, that's what makes us a superpower, and families make us a superpower as a country as well. And so creating what we call a family constitution, and I renamed that piece to call it 7th generation family constitution. So I want to jump back to that, but we start there, then we get to the 4 P's of a sustainable business, because I am an entrepreneur and I believe businesses are the backbone of any economy. Then I talk about the way to wealth. How do you manage the finances and your personal economic engine and your company economic engine? And then I talk about life, because what's the point of all that if we don't live a life of what I call health, wealth, wisdom, and happiness? So the interesting thing, my drive has been taking ancient wisdom and pairing it with modern day science and technology. So the way to wealth, healthy, wealthy, wise, and happy, I took those from Benjamin Franklin. They were some of his vernaculars, and I just repackaged them for our current day. What was interesting in this Legato family framework, as I was doing due diligence on the Constitution, is part of where it came from in my research with Benjamin Franklin is the Iroquois Confederacy and the Iroquois Nation and Native American tribes, the Great Law of Peace that was around and was like one of the longest standing documents that was out there proven to work. And then I saw, wait a minute, we left some things out. One of them being the role of women in leadership and government, and 2, 7th generation thinking. And so to me, that's why I'm calling this process 7th generation family constitutions, because that's part of at least my process or thought process of what got us in some of the challenges. We're not thinking about 7 generations. Are we even thinking about the next generation? So I would love to hear your thoughts on the Constitution, maybe what was left out, and just where did we miss the mark? And because I know you made some comments in your book about that, but I would love to hear more on that.
Well, first, the Articles of Confederation predated the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation failed because it did not provide enough power to the central government. And so there was a desire to try to be able to come up with something that might have a chance to succeed. And yet the fundamental principle was that the states, that the power belongs to the states and or the people, unless it was specifically ascribed to the federal government through the Constitution. All right. And there were certain fundamental principles under which we were founded: limited but effective federal government, individual liberty and opportunity, personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law, ideally equal justice under the law, but we had some problems there with regard to women and with regard to slaves, among other things. Okay. Fiscal responsibility, intergenerational equity, and an important word that we don't hear enough anymore called stewardship. All right. So those are the founding principles. And again, the power belonged to the states and to the people unless it was ascribed to the federal government. Now, if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, which technically was not voted on, but it kind of represents the executive summary, kind of represents this is what we really had in mind, right? It's interesting because when you look at the adjectives in there, you'll find that there's, there are differences in the words, and when you look at what the federal government is doing today, as compared to what the preamble says, 70% plus of federal spending does not relate to the words in the preamble. Less than 30% of the spending today relates to the word in the preamble of the Constitution. Things like national defense, homeland security, foreign relations, Congress of the United States, executive office of the president. I mean, less than 30% of spending and shrinking relates to the federal government. So the government has grown too big, it's promised too much, it's lost control of the budget, and it's eviscerated states' rights. So we can start with that.
It's a good starting point. Absolutely. And when I'm talking about for the family constitutions, it's similar actually. And I actually call ours the preamble. It's the trust preamble for that very reason. Like, what's the purpose of this? Before we get into the legalities and the wording, et cetera, trust can do a great job of protecting from taxes and asset protection and all these things. What are we really trying to accomplish here? That's the preamble to the trust to pass on to generation to generation.
And we also have to understand, Scott, that words don't mean the same thing in government. Okay. For example, you and I are familiar with what a legal trust is, right? It's a separate and distinct legal entity with fiduciary responsibility and liability, where the assets in the trust belong to the beneficiaries of the trust, right? You're supposed to manage it for the interest of those beneficiaries of the trust, all right? And there are real consequences if you don't. Well, the government has quote unquote trust funds. I put them in quotes because they're not real trust funds. You can't trust them, and they're not really funded because they're funded with government debt. And the two biggest examples of that are Social Security and Medicare, but there are others.
And so when I think of seventh generation thinking, it's thinking long term. When they were making decisions, they're like, how is this going to affect 7 generations from now? Our family, other families, and that seems to be missing certainly from how we're operating today as well. So what would you say are some of the real big challenges that we're faced with? You talk about a little bit in our book, but for the sake of the audience, what would you say are some of the really big challenges that we're faced with as of 2022?
Well, first, we have changing security threats. For the first time in decades, we have a real peer competitor, and that peer competitor is China. They're number 2 in nominal GDP. They're number 1 in purchasing power parity GDP, and they will pass us in nominal GDP within the next 10, 15 years. They passed us already in the number of embassies that they have around the world. In addition, their military is number 2 in the world and gaining strength. And they do have some cultural influence around the world. They have a strategic plan. You talk about 7 generations. That's how the Chinese think. They think long range. They have a plan, okay? And one element of that plan is the Belt and Road Initiative, which has strategic, diplomatic, economic, and military implications, if you will. All right, not just over land, but also overseas. The U.S. has no plan. The United States government has no strategic, comprehensive, long-range, interconnected, outcome-based, resource-constrained plan. There's none. All right. If you ask the government what's its plan, they'll say it's the budget. Well, the budget is policy. And by the way, the budget came out today, but it's 7 weeks late. Okay. So they're planning year to year, much less generational. And that's one of the things that we're missing. We don't have a plan. If you don't have a plan, all you have is prayer. I'm for prayer and a plan. Okay. And we don't think enough about what are the implications of the decisions that we're making today or failing to make today have on future generations. That's the word stewardship. To leave things better off and better positioned for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 7th generation thinking right there. And that's natural law thinking there too, right? The laws of nature and natural law thinks about sustainability and being regenerative and being able to make things better and leave things better than you found them. So talking about just fiscal policy, if we go there, some of the books I read, of course, some of this was pre-COVID. So what we've done with our monetary policy now, our national debt, all-time highs. And, I have my thoughts on that. It's part of the way to wealth is sound money. So if we were to put up our balance sheet and we were to walk through, a statement, and we look at it as the U.S. government, if I made those numbers smaller and I showed it as an individual family, we would say, well, what do we got to do? We have to increase revenue substantially, or we got to cut expenses substantially, or we got to file bankruptcy. Like, what options do we have here? And of course, it's just bigger numbers.
We don't have the option to file bankruptcy. There's only two financial items that are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, and they're in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Number one, debt of the United States and accrued interest. That is guaranteed by the Constitution. We have to honor that. All right. And by the way, when people say, well, we can't we can't not raise the debt ceiling because we'll default on the debt. That's false. We can't default on the debt. What it means is you got to either raise taxes or cut spending, and they don't want to do that. So that's why they end up having this, cry wolf to say we're going to default on the debt. That's false. The second thing that is guaranteed by the Constitution is Union Civil War pensions. And I think we've paid all of those. I'm from the South. I think I know why they didn't guarantee our pensions, but I'm not going to go there. Okay. But so the fact is, neither Social Security is not guaranteed, Medicare is not guaranteed, civilian and military pensions, retiree health care not guaranteed, defense spending is not guaranteed. Nothing's guaranteed but those two things. All right. And we've lost control of our finances. The government today is about 11 times bigger than it was as a percentage of the economy than it was in 1912. 2%. It was 2% of the economy then. It's almost 22% now. Okay. We controlled 97% of spending in 1912. The only thing we didn't control was interest. Now we control less than 30 and declining. And our debt as a percentage of the economy is about to hit an all-time high. And unlike the end of World War II, where it was coming down, it's going up. And here's the last thing. Let's take the financials. The latest financials were as of September 30, 2021. We had $110 trillion in net liabilities and unfunded promises. 110 trillion, not the $30 trillion debt. This is the real number, okay, which is about $1.4 million per federal income tax payer. And what is median household income? Less than $70,000 a year. Those numbers just don't work.
Yeah. I've heard you say there's a 4-letter word we're struggling with, right?
The new 4-letter word in fiscal policy is math.
So Democrats generally want to increase spending. Republicans, this is broad speaking, generally want to reduce taxes. I got all that. It's just, but
and you hammered on the bottom line. So the bottom line is they compromise, they spend more, they tax less, and the bottom line hemorrhages, and we mortgage the future of the country, which is irresponsible, unethical, and immoral.
Yeah, that's to me what is most troubling is, what's happening to kids, grandkids, great grandkids, and generations to come. Like that's the most troubling to me. And right, immoral. Like how do we leave things better than we found them in our short journey here? So
and
let's
better
talk
position for the future. And better position for the future.
100%.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
And that's what the book's all about. I mean, there is a way to do it. Okay. I mean, we're going to have to reprioritize and reduce spending. We're going to have to restructure social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure. We're going to have to reform the tax system to generate more revenues. Tax rates will probably never be lower than they are right now. Contrary to how most people have been taught their whole life that they'll pay a lower effective tax rate in retirement than when they're working, that's probably not going to be the case. All right. Yeah. Because we're going to have more revenues, and you're not going to just get it through growth. And people are probably going to have to work longer to get Social Security. They're probably not going to get as much of a subsidy for Medicare that they're getting right now. And so there's just a number of things that are going to happen in order to make the numbers work. And people need to be thinking about that. And how does that fit into their own financial and retirement planning and their plans for the future?
Yeah. So when I think about that, that's part of the challenge. And then now you're starting to give some solutions. And that's exactly where I want to hear to talk about. In my mind, what the Constitution was done, it was put there to give us guideposts, but also put there to have enough flexibility so that we could navigate the current climate that we're in. So when I think of leaving things better than you found them, so it's like showing up instead of what can I extract from, what can I do to make things better and serve this moment? Like that's what nature does. And if you look at, if I just say taxation, I mean, that's an extraction. Is that making things better than what we found them? And as an entrepreneur and a business owner, you need to bring value, and dollars follow value. So your lens needs to be, how do I make this person's life better? And then dollars follow that. So I think that's a missing element. people listening in, I think they don't know all the depth at all like you do. Certainly, you spent a lot of time on this and very smart man with a lot of background in this area. But I do think most know something doesn't feel right. There's just something that's amiss.
Well, Americans know you can't spend much more money than you make, charge it to the credit card without a limit, and not expect to have a day of reckoning at some point in time in the future. All right. The problem is our society is pretty myopic. It's very short-term focused. You know, what are our current problems? What am I concerned about today? All right. You know, even our politicians. I mean, our politicians are focused on what do I need to do to get reelected? They don't want to end up making tough choices until there's a crisis that gives them cover to make tough choices. An example of that is Social Security. The last time we reformed Social Security, the reason we reformed it when we did was because the so-called trust fund was going to go to zero within weeks, and tens of millions of seniors were going to have their checks cut. All right. The modern day equivalent of that is 2033 and getting closer every year. And you know, history being any guide, they'll wait until they get right up to the precipice before they do anything. When we know that it's prudent to do things sooner rather than later because you don't have to make as many changes, you have more time for transition, and you can avoid a crisis and help people to be able to plan with more certainty about their future and their future for their families. So, you know, that's why the thing that I've been pushing on a lot lately is to get a constitutional amendment that would set a credit card limit for the federal government and would set a more reasonable level of debt as a percentage of the economy as a target that we would need to get to over a 10 or 15 year period to make sure that we've got our finances in order so the economy can grow, so people have more opportunity, so people can plan with more certainty, and so we can discharge our stewardship responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. And this, I mean, so that's given examples, and I know it's that some of that's in the book as well, of what needs to be done to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability. And so there's some examples, and I want to ask personally, but before I do, any other thoughts on what can be done for more fiscal sanity and sustainability?
Well, yeah, I mean, for one thing, the debt ceiling limit has been a dismal failure. All right, we ought to get rid of it and substitute a debt to GDP approach. Congress has only passed timely budgets and appropriations bills 4 times in 70 years. That's an F minus. Okay, so we need to get our act together there. All right, we need to recognize we can't write blank checks for anything. All right, you can't write a blank check for health care. It'll bankrupt the country. All right, we have to rationalize our promises, change our payment systems, do a number of things. You know, we have to recognize people are living longer. And so we've got to reform Social Security. It means we're probably going to increase the eligibility age for retirement again, provide higher replacement rates for lower income people, somewhat lower replacement rates for upper income people. You know, maybe raise the taxable wage-based cap, but not the rate, because that's a very regressive tax. Okay, we're gonna have to spend more for defense, but we're wasting a lot of money in defense right now. I mean, you know, you wouldn't believe what a bloated bureaucracy the Defense Department is. I mean, we have to really significantly reduce the overhead and the bureaucracy in the Defense Department so we can free up funds to be able to deter aggression and be able to win armed conflicts if we have to fight them. So, you know, energy. I mean, you know, we were energy independent 15 months ago. That's not just an economic security issue. It's a foreign policy issue. It's a national security issue. We're producing 1.5 million barrels of oil less today than we were at the end of 2019. You know, it's supply and demand. Okay, and that's why prices are going up. It's called supply and demand. Okay, you know, and so I don't know. We could go on for a while, but these are just a few.
It's helpful, and I love it again that you give a path forward. But yeah, that whole law of supply and demand seems to be forgotten. Well, you mentioned one of the things I want to chat with you about is what people can do. So people are listening to this, business owners, entrepreneurs, and some retirees. All right, what do I do? Well, you mentioned one unconventional thing that's typically not talked about, and that is, what if taxes are on sale now? So versus maxing out qualified plans with the plan that you're going to either make less or going to be in a lower tax bracket in the future, your argument is that might not be the wisest thing for you to do. So for people listening, again, business owners, entrepreneurs, which aren't very bureaucratic, which I think is a good thing. And then even retirees, how should they be thinking about it, and what can they do on their own personal economic level currently, or at least what things could they be thinking about?
Well, first, as I said, tax rates, income tax rates will probably never be lower than they are right now, which means you need to rethink about, to the extent that you're saving, what type of vehicles are you using to save in? All right. Maybe a Roth IRA makes a lot more sense than a traditional IRA because of that fact, as an example. You also need to recognize, because with uncertainty comes volatility. Okay. And that means you're going to get a lot more volatility in the markets. All right. And therefore, if you want more certainty, you need to think about what kind of investments you're investing in, including maybe certain kinds of insurance products might make sense under certain circumstances. All right. You also have to think about life expectancies. Life expectancies, other than when you have pandemics, are getting longer, if you will. And therefore, you need to think about, do you have enough to be able to have a reasonable standard of living throughout your life? You're likely to live longer than you think you might live. Healthcare costs. Healthcare costs are the biggest problem going forward. We've promised way more than we can afford to be able to sustain. And so you're likely to have to pay more for healthcare than you're thinking of, right now. So those are just, a few examples of where you look at the big picture, you recognize the government, is overpromised. It's got to restructure its finances. It's going to raise more revenues. It's going to cut back on spending. How does that affect you and your family? And what can you do about it? Mm-hmm. Oh, by the way, the other thing you need to do is elect fiscally responsible people and to hold them accountable to make sure that they're not continuing our irresponsible ways, which will not enable us to ensure that our future is better than our past.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. And so, yeah, I agree with that. Just thinking of options. So we talk about certainly cash flow and control, and that's really broad. So like if you think that we're the benefits of healthcare, we may be living longer. Well, you got to think about cash flow for a much longer period of time. Taxation. If taxes are on sale now and they're at the lowest situation we may be in for some time or even ever, well, how does that affect whether you do a 1031 exchange or these other things to continue, where most people say do this? It may not make the most sense. And the other thing is just on a day, one of the things I talk about on the cash flow and control, I also talk about congruency. And what I mean by that is, are you investing in something that's congruent with you? What's your investor DNA? We're all unique beings. What resonates with you? And that where do you get your food? Where do you get, who are you supporting with that dollar? Who are you voting for with support? So
all the money.
It's exactly right. Follow the money. It's very true. Anything else on an individual level that people could be thinking about? And you gave a good one right there, follow the money. That could help them.
Well, think about inflation.
Yeah.
This is not transitory inflation. Okay. I mean, yes, we have some supply chain disruptions. Yes, there are supply demand imbalances that have been exacerbated in the short term. Okay. But when you spend, but when spending is out of control and when monetary policy is enabling irresponsible fiscal policy, and when the Fed is holding down interest rates artificially low and buying almost all the new debt, those are inflationary. Okay, and so think about, well, if inflation will moderate, I think, over time, but it's not going to get back to where it was anytime soon unless we really change course, right? So what does that mean to you? Mm-hmm. It also means what kind of investment should you have? What are the things that generally keep, that keep pace or exceed inflation?
Yeah. We talk about 3 buckets of the weight of wealth without going through it. The audience certainly knows it, but savings, income, and growth. And so having savings for emergency and opportunities, and having savings where you can have a hedge. Like, can we hedge against a market correction or inflation or the dollar? So, and there's ways to do that. And then income producing could be, as you mentioned, potentially insurance, or it could be some sort of laddered portfolio. But how do you keep cash flow and income coming in for the rest of your life? Then you can think about growth, because we do need to, and with those done, you can swing for the fences over here on the growth piece, because you do need to keep up with inflation and be investing in ways. So people say, look at the pump, look at the gas prices. And it's like, yes, well, what can you do to control and stay congruent? Well, if you're congruent with the investment, you could invest in people who benefit from rising gas prices. So there are ways to think about how do you stay relevant and stay sovereign and in somewhat control of your personal economy, no matter what's going on a global basis. Which kind of
comes back to the theory of follow the money too.
It does. That's exactly right. For sure. Yeah. And I think it's for me, it's always been about freedom. That's why I really became an entrepreneur, and then personal sovereignty. And I do like to see patterns and make things simple. And then share that. So that's the purpose of the podcast. How can we make money simple to allow people to really focus on living life fully and doing it now? And money's a big factor in that. It's not the end game. You know, you could have $1 billion and still be miserable, but it is certainly part of how we need to operate, and a big part of our national economy, but it's also a very part of our individual economy. What can we do now? So taxes, longevity to think about, follow the money. You said, agree with all three of those to think about. What can you control of those things? How can you position yourself so that you have some more control over those things, which we talk about on a weekly basis?
And in my case, what I've done, I mean, I'll never be super wealthy, although I'm comfortable, because I've given more than half my life to public service. And if you're honest, and I am, you don't get wealthy in public service. Now, there are people who have, and let's just say they're not honest. But in any event, and so what I've done, let's take your buckets. All right. I've got enough annuities where I'm comfortable. You know, I've got income guaranteed for life for myself and my wife. So I'm okay on that. Right. I've got too much cash, way too much cash right now, because I'm concerned about market volatility. All right. At the same point in time, you know, you might be able to withstand that when inflation is less than 2%, but when inflation is 7%, that's not a good place to be. All right. You know, at the same point in time, I have investments that, you know, that are appropriately diversified, if you will, that hopefully will end up helping me with regard to the hedge against inflation and help to be able to maintain and hopefully build on my net worth. And so, you know, I'm like you. I like to practice what I preach. All right. And unfortunately, not enough people do.
Towards the end of the process, we talk about taxes, and we talk about tax diversification, which is you sounds like you're applying the buckets on your own. And then it's like tax diversification, where you have tax deferred, or I call it tax postponed. It may or may not be the best place to be, even though that's where most of their money is. Then taxable, then tax free. Just have an option so that you have some options no matter what happens to taxes based on your investment portfolio. So it makes sense to me as well.
Well, diversification is a principle that applies broadly.
Yeah, totally. Super helpful, informative. David, would love to have you back on. If you're open to it in the future, we could go deeper on some of these topics and subjects. I would just say the book, great read. And this is one of multiple, but pulled it back out. I'm not quite done, but as I mentioned, great information on America in 2040. And then you mentioned some of the work on amending the Constitution, which, you know what, I think that was part of what they had in mind without going down that rabbit hole too far. This was not to be. It's what I talk about on family constitutions. This is not to be, I have all the answers and I create this family constitution for our family. I'm going to share what I know, recognizing 100 years from now, people living then are going to know more about that time than I knew 100 years before. And I think that's the idea of what you're talking. It's music to my ears, because I don't think the founding fathers was like, set it and forget it. No, this is the principles at this time, but let's leave enough flexibility that smart people can make additions and subtractions to navigate the climate that's in front of us at that time.
And that's part of the whole concept of striving to form a more perfect union. At the same point in time, this country was founded on certain principles and values that I would argue are timeless. And unfortunately, we've strayed for some of those, and we need to get back to them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And same even in family constitutions. There'll be certain values that are non-negotiable in the family constitution. These are timeless. These are principles that will never change. And let's leave enough flexibility that you can navigate 100, 200, 300 years from now based on what's going on at that time in your life and in the country and abroad. So
and the central core value that I have for myself in every organization that I've ever led, and I've led organizations in the public, private, and not-for-profit sector, is integrity. You don't have integrity, you don't have much.
Yes, totally agree. And we set up core values for our family. I think it's a good exercise for us all to do, to share, because, great grandkids, et cetera, might not be around. So why not share where I screwed up and what I learned from them and what I did right and what I learned from that with some key core values to pass on to generations. So I love what you're doing, David. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Again, would welcome to have you back on in time, and happy to support you on this journey and what you're up to. And people, as far as wanting to learn more about your work, I mentioned the book, America in 2040. Where else would you point them if they wanted to learn more about you or your work?
Well, if they're interested in the book, they can go to Amazon, they can go to Barnes and Noble, or they can go to Arthur House, who's the publisher, online. You can order it online. Comes in several forms. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. David M. Walker, former U.S. Comptroller General. Look me up. But thanks again, Scott, for the opportunity. Be happy to try to come back again at some point in time in the future.
Yeah, would love you. Thank you again. And to the audience, thanks for joining again, the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple, allowing you to focus on living now fully and doing that again now, not 30 years from now. So we'll see you on next week's podcast.
The opinions voiced in Way to Wealth with Scott Ford, Managing Director, Partner, and Wealth Advisor of Carson Wealth, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial, or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Way to Wealth are not affiliated with CWM LLC or Cetera Advisor Networks LLC. Legato Family is not affiliated with Cetera Advisor Networks LLC or CWM LLC. Carson Wealth, 19833 Leitersburg Pike, Suite 1, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742.